Hello, and welcome back to the White Pew podcast. I am ZM, and it is Sunday, the 21st of September, 2025. If you don't know, the White Pew is a website that I run with my friend and collaborator, Gabrielle de la Puente. We take turns to publish a text every Sunday about art, exhibitions, culture at large, whatever takes our fancy. And you can find the text versions of those texts on thewhitepube.com or .co.uk. This podcast feed is where we publish the audio versions of those texts so you can hear us, the writers, reading our own words in our own voices, if this is your medium or format of choice. All of that to say, I feel like I've been away for ages, long time no see, I hope you're well. I feel very rusty, like I've not written anything in this short form format for a while. Having said that, I have a text for you this week that is kind of an essay, kind of a weird short story. I think this is the weirdest thing I've ever written. I'm surprised by it myself. All the same, I'm going to read it to you, and you make your mind up about whether it makes sense. I'm going to get straight to reading it, but stay tuned till the end, and I'll give you this week's emoji to comment on the Instagram post, please. Okay, thanks. This week's text is called Onion Jack. John wants to fuck the St. George's flag. The St. George's flag doesn't have a hole. The St. George's flag doesn't have a material form, actually. Like, it isn't a real object that exists in our world of people and objects. It is actually an image. John wants to fuck it all the same. He wants to feel its harsh lines and sharp angles against his skin. Delicate caress. He wants to press up against it and moan, sweat, breathe heavy, and release into it. John is a complex man. He understands that the St. George's flag isn't actually an image. It is a semiotic object. It is a sign. Well, maybe it is more accurately described as a symbol. John clears his throat, points his finger at a PowerPoint slide. This is the sign, the signified and the signifier. The signified is the concept the sign represents. The signifier is the form it takes. The sign is an oval with a line cutting it in half horizontally. The signified is in the top half, the signifier the bottom. John taps the slide with his pointing finger. John smiles. The flag isn't a flag. It isn't a textile. It isn't a print. It isn't a shape. It isn't an object. St. George's cross is a Union Jack, is a butcher's apron, is an image of the Queen. But she's dead. But it doesn't matter. But she was never alive. But she was only ever an image. But she was a signifier. But it was always about what she signified. But that hasn't changed. Exactly. It is all a very fluid and blurry thing. We can paint red X's on our faces when the football's on. We can share it with Genoa and Sardinia and Barcelona and the nation-state of Georgia. We can nod smugly when Guardian columnists say St. George was Palestinian, like facts could ever make a dent on public reckoning. We can spray paint a red X on the white blob of a mini roundabout, and Zarina will see one in southwest London and shit herself. It doesn't even matter. This text is an obscure expression of anxiety. Very catastrophic thinking. Except Zarina's right to shit herself. One day when, not if, when Nigel Farage is Prime Minister. When, not if, when Tommy Robinson comes marching back through Waterloo. One day it won't seem so much like catastrophising. But it is just a red X. It isn't even about John. Because John doesn't exist. Yes, he does. In 1712, John Arbuthnot, an Enlightenment-era gentleman polymath, Scottish man in London, published a series of political pamphlets. In an effort to swing public opinion behind the Tory government and their attempt to end the War of Spanish Succession by withdrawing England from its international alliances, Arbuthnot dramatised the political situation as an allegorical interpersonal conflict / farce. France and its king, Louis XIV, Louis Bourbon, I don't know, was personified as Louis Baboon, and England was personified as John Bull. John Bull was a stout middle-aged country squire. He wore a Union Jack waistcoat and a top hat. He was jolly, he was matter-of-fact, he was stubborn. He was Middle England. He was entirely made up, like literally fabricated from projections, put together from all these handed down assumptions about what England's national character might be. John Bull stuck around as the symbolic personification for England. Newspaper cartoonists had a field day with him. He appears on wartime posters, is embodied in teapots and Toby jugs. In summer 1748, William Hogarth was on holiday in Paris. On his way back to London, he found himself in Calais waiting for a boat. He passed the time by sketching the port's gate and drawbridge. Calais had been an English enclave up until 1558, and many of the buildings had English architectural features. It was all very curious and interesting. That was until French soldiers spotted him, thought he was a spy, very suspicious, making note of their civil infrastructure and fortifications, and arrested him. To avoid the 18th century version of banged up abroad, and to demonstrate that he was not a spy, literally just an innocent artist, he showed the French authorities his sketches and offered to draw them anything they requested. They requested a scene of an enormous piece of roast beef landing on the shore and heading to the Lion d'Argent, an English inn in Calais, followed by a trail of hungry friars. Apparently, roast beef was seen as an iconically British thing, like fish and chips or bangers and mash. The French nickname for English people was les rosbifs. Les rosbifs, or the roast beefs. The guards outside the Tower of London are called beef eaters. So iconic, their image is printed on the bins at Gatwick Airport. Hogarth was actually a founding member of the Sublime Society of Beefsteaks, a roast beef club that would meet for beefsteaks and port at 2 p.m. Members wore waistcoats with brass buttons embossed with the society's motto, Beef and Liberty. The president wore a beef eater's bearskin hat. Roast beef, a symbol, a sign, a semiotic object. Signifier, roast beef. Signified, England. Hogarth's drawings seemed to prove he wasn't a spy, and the French released him. As soon as he got back to London, he began work on a painting. At the port gate of Calais, a hunk of beef is destined for the Lion d'Argent. It is being carried by a chef in white. A hungry friar and a group of men, soldiers and civilians, gather round to exalt the beef. To the right, 2 soldiers carry an unappetising bucket of grey, watery French soup. A sad soldier in tartan is slumped against the wall, staring down in horror and disappointment at a raw French onion. The painting is called Oh, the Roast Beef of Old England. It is seen as one of Hogarth's most patriotic works. Yes, Hogarth, one of the most iconically British artists. This is the image that represents the pinnacle of his national image making. It's like this. British beef, national symbol. French food is so bad, it makes Scottish soldiers sad. Watery soup, les oignons, everyone is jealous of our roast beef. It becomes a national symbol. John is very real. John wants to deport the migrants, stop the boats. You can fuck off back to where you came from. If you don't like it, you know where the door is. John wants to march through Westminster with Tommy Robinson. John wants good old-fashioned British values. John says there's no such thing as the far right. He's not far right. He's just a concerned individual. He wants to save the kids. He says this isn't about racism. It's about being patriotic. He says it's winter fuel and the benefits cap. And Keir Starmer is a wanker. Everything just seems to be falling apart and this country's going to dogs. And maybe Enoch Powell was right after all. And These days, they'll throw you in jail just for saying you're English. England isn't about multiculturalism. England is about English culture. People coming over here have to assimilate into English culture. John says, if you can't put up your own country's flag in said own country, something isn't right. A flag is a country's most neutral and indisputable symbol. John is interested in the way symbols work, how a symbol can become a national symbol, how national symbols can fall apart. The nation state is as fabricated as John is, so you have this weird empty link chain. John Bull, projection, personification of England, arbitrary landmass, as a nation state, socially constructed political unit that seeks to centralise power. English flag, signifier, the form and not the content, and the English people. Ha ha ha. Who are they? You see? None of that was ever real. John looks back at the PowerPoint slide, signifier/signified. He sits down at a table with 2 chairs. The enormous piece of roast beef sits across from him. The roast beef has got something to say. The roast beef thinks there's something a bit postmodern about the way meaning is made and only to be blasted apart. Once upon a time, John Bull was the figurative symbol of England, personification itself, national character in singular human form. Then roast beef, not singular human, but at least still a lump of meat. Not personification, but meatification. The national culture as national meat. One step towards the abstract. It is interesting and noteworthy that John Bull and the roast beef of Old England came about as hearty national symbols in the first half of the 18th century, when Great Britain was brand new. The Acts of Union in 1707 formally unified Scotland, England and Wales, and expanding its empire so the sun would never set across it, fighting back other European colonial powers for control over the transatlantic slave trade and Bengal, and the Industrial Revolution was due to be kicking off, colonialism and capitalism bouncing along hand in hand. But as time goes on, through modernity and progress and change, the symbol is eroded until it is just a shape, a cross, a red X. The purest form of the image, line, mark making. We no longer trust our institutions, our experts, our authorities. We don't even trust our royal family. The nation cannot be personified because a person is not a reliable or trustworthy form. They are also not an empty form, ready and willing to take on the burden of meaning. They are too full of their own character stuff. So, shapes become symbols. These empty forms can carry what we, you, John Bull, me, roast beef, Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, the far right and concerned individuals project onto them. Which is fine, natural. It was always going to happen. But it means that St George's roundabouts aren't just line, shape and mark making. The flag then can't be a country's most neutral and indisputable symbol. You can't really put up your own flag in your own country, and we have just built a symbol that must be blasted apart. John Bull nods as roast beef speaks, but he doesn't quite understand why the blasting apart bit is inevitable. Roast beef sighs. He stands up and leads the way. From Baker Street down Chiltern Street, opposite the burnt-out firehouse, a gallery called Incubator Projects and Maya Gurung Russell Campbell's show, I Want to Be Ready. The artist has deconstructed the Union Jack and St George's flag, ripped them into strips and knotted them together with bits of old military tent, jute and ropes. They are tied up into these bulbous, suspended shapes, gnarled and weathered and dripping. John Bull imagines the repetitive act. Double knot, double knot, double knot, building the sculpture out bigger, it expands. Roast beef imagines the act before the knotting, the invisible and implied act, where the artist, at some point, must have torn the flags into ribbons. Roast beef is interested in the act of destruction because Destruction isn't necessarily an act that seeks to flatten or obliterate or even actually totally destroy. Some destructions seek to transform, make everything liquid and malleable. Sometimes it seeks to remake. Roast Beef thinks about Walter Benjamin's critique of violence and the idea that there are two types of violence: mythical violence and divine violence. Mythical violence as the violence of change that transforms, destroys one thing to substitute it with a new other thing. Divine violence is the destruction beyond the possibility of a return to order. Roast Beef thinks about Kazimir Malevich and his black square. That sucking void of a painting, that portal, that open window. Because Malevich painted it in Russia in 1915, in the soup of imminent revolution. Revolution being the radical destruction of an existing society, the radical destruction of a society's existing culture. No sentimentality or nostalgia for the past, deaf to nostalgia, deaf to the bourgeoisie, deaf to the imperial nation state. Black Square was meant to be a doorway, was meant to be violent. Through the portal, destructive impulses could flood in and wash the old art away. Was it mythological violence or divine violence? In 1919, Malevich wrote an essay called On the Museum. Post-revolution, he calls for the revolution to extend itself to culture. Enough of crawling about the corridors of time past. Malevich calls for a mode of artistic production that looks only towards the future, that burns down the past to make way for new life. In burning the past doesn't disappear but collapses. In burning a corpse, we obtain 1 gram of powder. The powder is the old thing, reconstituted in a new form. The essence of the old thing is still there, still communicative and energetically alive, but the old form is dead. But maybe, as powder, it's more fit to be remade into something new. John Bull looks at the double-knotted, ruined flag. Roast Beef's whole Malevich and destruction shtick doesn't quite fit. The impulse is the same, but there's something about the form that doesn't feel destroyed enough to count as reconstitution or transformation. The old form still remains. Anyway, Malevich's Black Square was an image that existed after that destruction of the old. Not a remaking into the new, but an image of the destruction that sat in the destruction. That's the portal. That's the doorway. Black Square sits on the liminal edge between old and new, acts as the conduit between them. It is an image that cannot be destroyed, or it is an image that has already been completely destroyed without possibility of a return to order. Maybe the image exists in a karmic wheel of making and destruction. Maybe the image never dies, only goes through this cycle over and over. Maybe images are actually subject to constant change. Black Square is the essence that moves through the wheel. The flags are mythically transformed, remade into a new form. Roast Beef nods his meaty lump of a head. But exactly. The image is the symbol, is the wheel. The nation doesn't exist. Its symbol goes through the karmic wheel of change, being made and unmade, only to be remade over and over again. You, John Bull. Me, Roast Beef. Red X on your face when the football's on. Red X on a roundabout to make Zarina shit herself. Red X is in the sky when, not if, when, Nigel Farage is Prime Minister. When, not if, when, Tommy Robinson comes marching back through Waterloo. Made, unmade, remade again. Flag, nation, symbol. We put these things together like they are the same thing, but Roast Beef taps a pointed finger towards the slide. Sign equals signified over signifier. This country's going to the dogs, and we're talking about the signifier. What is the change doing? Where is the signified? Kazimir Malevich's shtick wants to exit the cycle, destroy the sign, or create an image of its destruction. Is that even possible? Do we even want that? John Bull looks back up at the double-knotted, ruined flags. He isn't so sure anymore. Once upon a time, he wanted to fuck this flag, as some oblique metaphor about desire for proximity to its power. More and more, it seems less like a hole and more like a sucking void, a portal, open window to the destruction of existing society, and John Bull doesn't know what is on the other side. And that is this week's text. Thank you very much for listening, / reading. And please can for the emoji. I don't know whether I want an England flag, actually, St George's flag, or an onion emoji. Both would amuse me, actually. So whichever one you would find most amusing, because I think there's something in the name of this text that feels like the title of the text represents the thought that I've not managed to like shoehorn into this, which is, it's interesting that those national symbols are like of John Bull and the roast beef were symbols that were made externally. They came from outside England, from a Scottish polymath and from French soldiers in Calais. But the England flag, the red X's on the roundabout, they come from within. And I think that's interesting. And yeah, the idea of the roast beef and the French onions feels like it represents something that is flipped. It represents a dynamic that is flipped in relation to all of this, right? Which is what I'm writing about, but I'm not quite verbalising. So, St George's flags and onions, maybe. Yeah, go on. Why choose? Thank you very much for listening. I will see you next time. Gabrielle will be with you next week. Have a lovely time in between and stay safe. Goodbye.